Well, howdy there, folks. James, Political Friar, coming to you again. Got the University of Oregon hat on, and so we're going to have a political topic today. It's going to be another entry in our series of undetermined length about why Donald Trump won the election in 2024. In this one, we're going to talk about the effect of the culture wars and the effect that they had on Donald Trump's ability really to escape blame and the condemnation from the left. And it is fundamentally that the left, through the Biden presidency and a little before, got a little over their skis with where America was culturally. And in so doing, they hurt their credibility. And so when the time came for those very same messengers who were a little bit discredited by taking a little bit out of the sort of middle of the road positions earlier, were also discredited when they cried wolf. And that Donald Trump may very well have deserved the cries and warnings was tamped down by all of the previous cries and warnings that just didn't land. They didn't land on all fours. And so let's talk a bit chronologically, although these first two are going to be pretty similar in their timing. The first thing that we want to talk about is the effect of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters protests that uh, got going during 2020. There is an undeniable truth that what happened to George Floyd was an awful crime. The jury convicted, and we should trust juries to make those sorts of judgments. And the George Floyd crime became a symbol for race relations writ large in the United States, and in particular, relations between police and the communities, not necessarily even minorities, because those folks who were most strident in their opposition to police work as it is currently composed, or as it was composed in 2010, did not be minorities. They tended to be white liberals. White liberals were the strongest subsection of folks when talking about issues surrounding race relations that you might otherwise be considered sort of the pro African American idea. For example, white liberals support reparations at a higher level than blacks do. It is an interesting phenomenon and how that might have arisen, but it also means that many of the messengers that you had on the Black Lives Matters protest and the police reform were saying things that absolutely, arguably were true and absolutely needed to be done, but they also were saying things that sounded a lot like scolding. It sounds a lot like self hate, not a, a idea of reform of the society at large. It is, in a weird way, a little bit white supremacist in that it was white people telling white people how to behave. And that message, it ran a little tin for many folks who ended up being Trump supporters who weren't willing to condemn themselves, who weren't willing to acknowledge their own self hatred in their own racism, regardless of whether it was true or not. In a democracy, that self perception of the still dominant demographic group was not helpful. The folks who ended up voting for Donald Trump felt attacked, felt accused, felt like one minute they were living their lives in a relatively just way, and the next minute they were the big bad. And unsurprisingly, when somebody is accused, rightly or wrongly, the first thing they do is deny it. And the Donald Trump supporters denied it. And that makes some sense. This is a replay of the same kind of political correctness cycle that we've been going through since the 60s. The left wants to embrace revolutionary vocabulary and some rather interesting, or let's say non-traditional social ideas, and they traditionally go too fast. I mean, things like same-sex marriage were a paragon of left thinking in the 60s. There you can find people who would support same-sex marriage, but it wasn't until the 2010s that society was ready to embrace that. Then absolutely radical idea. Well, in the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, you had an opportunity for the far left progressive culture warriors to present their ideas as the solve to this truly dramatic and awful event. And the mainstream Democrats picked it up. And you can see this in the primaries in 2020. Kamala Harris was in favor of reparations. The Kamala Harris who ran for president in 2020 was unrecognizable from the person who ran for president in 2024. And that means that, well, who's real? And the real answer, of course, is both. That she's a politician, but she was a politician who was responding to the winds of the very far, I will call them radical culture warriors in her own party. These folks who were usually maligned and sidelined because their ideas, right, wrong, or otherwise, were unpopular, were given center stage. And the reaction was to believe that the Democratic Party writ large wasn't reliable. It just wasn't credible to police its own far left. And this, unfortunately, was reinforced by COVID itself. See, the natural and correct response to COVID is exactly what Donald Trump did in 2020. He went with the best information we had, right, wrong, or otherwise, because we now know that things like lockdowns in schools were super harmful, but we didn't know that then. So Donald Trump went for lockdowns in schools. Well, we now know that masking, while laboratory effective on a population level for one reason or another, probably because you couldn't actually get everybody to mask, wasn't particularly effective. We now know that if you were under the age of 50 and didn't have comorbidities, there wasn't much reason for you to take COVID precautions. We now know all these things. And we knew then that we needed a vaccine. We absolutely needed a vaccine, and Donald Trump, to his great and everlasting credit, started Operation Warp Speed to get us that vaccine. And by 2021, we had it, and the pandemic started to abate. But until then, there was a invitation to, again, mostly liberals, to go out into their community and enforce new social norms such as 6 feet distance, new social norms such as wear a mask, new social norms such as don't go over to somebody's house if you've recently recovered from COVID. There's a million new rules in the culture that came into place and were enforced by left wingers and the Democrats who stood behind an expert who, like Dr. Fauci, was doing his best, but you can only do so well in hindsight when you have extremely limited information, and especially when the stakes were so high. And so the types of interventions that we saw were good, but they also were burdensome. And after the fact, you can see that some of them were silly. And that blew the credibility of the experts who were telling people what to do. The credibility of the folks who, for example, come out and say that the vaccine will 100% of the time prevent you from ever contracting COVID. Well, that's just not true. That's not how vaccines work. But for some reason, probably a good one, in that that type of absolutist statement probably had an effect on vaccine uptake rate. They said it, but it was untrue. And in that it was untrue, it allowed for a little worm of doubt to creep into the minds of those folks who would potentially support Donald Trump because the Democrats weren't credible. It is not that they were necessarily lying, it's that they were not telling the whole truth. They weren't trusting people with any kind of discretion to make decisions of their own. They were simply telling them how to be. They were scolds. They were scolding the population, and just like the kid who's got a dirty room who says, "Mom, you can't tell me what to do. It's my room. I don't care if it's dirty," there's a portion of the population that will react that way. That type of independent mindedness is actually a bit of a hallmark of the American polity, and so we shouldn't necessarily be expected that expect anything other than that when experts come and frankly overstate their case. They might have been knowingly overstating their case. They might have been strategically overstating their case, and yet their credibility was harmed. And come 2024, when we actually have a bit of hindsight, we can give those experts grades based off of what we know now. Well, they don't look like they're coming out really as well as they would have liked to, and certainly not as well as they purported to be when they were scolding the population. And thus, the Democrats lost a little bit of credibility. Now, the next area where I think the Democrats lost a little credibility was much closer to the election. After the Roe v. Wade decision was overturned in 2022, the Democrats rode a wave of panic and security among the very suburban voters that actually decide American elections to pretty good performance in 2022, at least no big red wave. And they took from that the lesson that abortion was popular. The Democrats, for a long time, have avoided stepping on this landmine. They don't say they're pro abortion. At least they didn't. They don't say that because abortion is still kind of yucky. I mean, it's hard to deny that the idea of removing a embryo from a mom's body for good reasons usually, it's still a tragedy, right? At least in most people's minds, you can agree with Hillary Clinton when you say that, well, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Well, the Democrats got a little over their skis on this in the 2024 election because they saw an area where they were polling well. Their policies on abortion were extremely popular, but it is too easy to slide over that line from being pro-choice to being pro-abortion. And if you have folks who are glorifying abortion and they are presenting themselves in particular to communities like the Latino communities who are Catholic, who are by their cultural nature certainly anti-abortion, it's going to hurt your credibility. And so this party, the Democrats, had spent a good portion of their time between 2020 and 2024 out on cultural missions that, right, wrong, or otherwise, didn't help their credibility when they started crying wolf about the dangers of a Donald Trump presidency. These are the same people who told us that. These are the same people who told Donald Trump voters that they're racists. Now, I know that's not exactly what they said, but that's what the Donald Trump voter heard. And frankly, it stopped mattering how bad Donald Trump was because you just couldn't trust the messenger. The Democrats had lost their ability to credibly cry wolf. And so when the wolf was at the door, well, nobody believed him. And Democrats didn't help themselves by rightly fighting Donald Trump with every type of hyperbolic rhetoric that they could come up with. I happen to agree that Donald Trump was not the right candidate to elect in the last election, but I can understand how many people just didn't care what the Democrats were saying after the Democrats had proved themselves to be unreliable on other issues that affected them, at least in spirit. So the overreach of the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and that reaction and the COVID remedial actions that required a degree of social cohesion that inevitably resulted in scolds, and then this slight slide away from the pro-choice, the abortion, we don't like it, but it should be safe and legal, to we're pro-abortion, at least in rhetoric or at least in vibe, I think really hurt the Democrats' credibility. And then they said Donald Trump is the worst person to come along, since Hitler. And there's a certain part of you that says, well, Hitler was a human. He wasn't a mythical creature, and you can do some evaluation about how authoritarians end up, degrading democracies and all that stuff. And this channel has done that analysis a lot, but nobody's ears were open. At least not the people who decided the election. The people who decided the election on other grounds. Donald Trump's fitness for office, it just didn't end up resonating. Probably because these are the same folks who had been told over and over again by the same messengers that they're the big bad, not Donald Trump. Well, it didn't work out. Anyway, hope you like that. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Hit like this video, help other people find it. Maybe share it or tell another person. I promise we're going to get more of these out as we go. It's a promise you've heard before, and yeah, I keep it intermittently. Anyway, I appreciate it. Thanks.